The live export panel, I guess, has come out of a fair bit of community debate generally over the last number of years, and obviously was brought to a bit of a head, that whole issue, which is now 2 years ago, with the suspension of live trade in Indonesia. But it's been, it's been quite an interesting debate in the community, from the point of view that it's been really crystallised by individuals with strong individual views, and often not a well, a broad band, a sort of broad base for views that have been held. So it's become, obviously, it's a fairly emotive issue. So I guess the idea behind this was to give you some perspectives on the live export issue, looking into the future. So we've asked our speakers to look 10 years into the future and have their view on what that industry would look like. Because obviously you're need positioning your business for the future, so you need to have a bit of a feel for those issues, and we do need to consider everyone's opinions. So that's where we're at. So we'll just start introducing you to Fred Troncone. Fred is CEO of Willards, and Willards aren't just live exports. Willards have relationships and businesses relationships with people who receive our live export in other countries. So these fellas every day talking, doing deals with people in different countries is second nature to them. It's still quite a bit foreign to most of us here. But Willards have been investing in new boats and new technology and all that sort of stuff around the livestock export industry to do the best of what they do, and they've held themselves a pretty high profile. We're a bit lucky today in the notice report program forward by a couple of hours because obviously in the last couple of weeks the Australian government and the Indonesian governments are meeting in Queensland, and both Fred Troncone and Chris Back are off to get on a plane straight after this to go to that meeting in Queensland. So they're very involved in the industry, and so we'll start by welcoming Fred Troncone.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks very much for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to address you and I guess present a bit of a livestock exporter's view of the world, and certainly a bit of a challenging task, I think, to look forward into the future by 10 years. During the break, I had a chance to speak to Annie, and it was quite interesting to ask a futurist about their view about where this industry is going to go. And I think we have a minor disagreement about the outcomes, but hopefully I can back up some of I guess our statements with a few statistics, and also I guess some experience, on the ground experience. As Ellie mentioned, we do a fair bit of travelling. I looked at my passport the last couple of weeks, and it's almost full again. I only just got that issued last year. And so we do actually get out into the market and speak to people all over the world. Just sort of to kick things off. Okay, just a quick overview. So Wallard is a company which has been around for about 50 years, and obviously live exports is where we started, but we've also now diversified into farming. So we've got about 50,000 hectares of farming land in Western Australia primarily. But we're also involved in downstream processing. Some of you may know that we recently purchased the Bradford River Meats facility down in Kojonup. So we're involved in processing both here and overseas. We have a facility in the Philippines where we export our own cattle and we fatten it there and process it there. So we've got a fairly large exposure. We've run programs in Saudi Arabia, and we're currently actively exporting to places like China, Russia, Kazakhstan. Obviously Indonesia is one of our main customers, Qatar and so on. So we've got a fairly good view of what's happening around the world. What's that mean? So I guess that the reason why I told you a little bit about Wallard is that we see ourselves as leaders in this field. Now, whether we're the top exporter or not is I guess varies depending on what you're talking about. But certainly we are fairly serious about doing the job properly. So our investment in ships and our investment in facilities, I think, is second to none. And we're very focused on quality. And I think that's what sets us apart from the others. Having said that, I tend to have a fairly positive view of what's going to happen in the next 10 years. And I say that I think with good reason. So what's driving our trade? Well, I think this is. In the last 10 years, we've seen some fairly significant increases in protein production. So, for example, in Indonesia, we've seen, Southeast Asia, we've seen a massive increase in protein consumption, and yet they're not able to supply all the protein that they need. You know, same in China. China is exploding at the moment, and you know, the importation of dairy cattle primarily, but also a lot of beef and lamb and so on, is just taking off. And we think that will continue for the next few years. In the next slide, I'll show you some predictions from ABARES that sort of support that. But I guess that tells a story to me is that, you know, the last 10 years, very, very strong growth. And certainly in Australia, we are able to supply a lot of these, particularly neighbouring countries like Indonesia and Southeast Asia. Obviously, the markets further away are a little bit more difficult to service because of the economics of the logistics there. So the demand projections. So this is, as I said, data that we've extracted from ABARES, but, you know, very interesting to see that, you know, looking even further than 10 years, that demand from neighbouring countries is going to increase significantly. In some cases, more than double. So particularly for things like beef and lamb, we see that there are already places like China and certainly the Middle East, you know, there is demand outstrips supply at the moment. Now, Australia is ideally positioned to service them. I heard the comments just earlier in the previous presentation about the exchange rate. Of course, you know, if we can get the Aussie dollar down to 80, 85 US cents, then that makes us very, very competitive. The issues that we've had in the past couple of years have really been the high Aussie dollar has really made the Australian product not competitive. So we have struggled, I guess, whilst the mining boom is happening. So for me, it's actually good news that we're seeing a bit of a decline in the US dollars and a bit of a decline in the mining industry, because it really does help agricultural exports. So why is live export important? And I'm not going to hear a counter argument very, very soon, but from our perspective, it is very important for the Australian producer, because we've seen what happens when live export is temporarily interrupted. And I'd like to acknowledge the source of these couple of charts, and they come straight out of the NLA Live Link in July. But we saw what happened in 2011 when the Indonesian market was suspended, and we had a massive range of producers in the Northern Territory and in the northern parts of WA and northern Queensland who saw a significant decrease in their farm gate prices for their cattle. You know, literally, we were buying steers for $2 a kilo, and after that suspension, the price dropped to about $1.65, $1.55 in some cases. And so the suspension of that market, even for 2 months, had a devastating effect on producers in the north. They have got very few options to do, with their land. If they can't actually raise beef and beef cattle, then they don't have too many other places to go. And we saw quite a number of farm closures and just people looking after properties because they just couldn't make it work. Now, particularly the Northern Territory, but certainly the Kimberley and also Farmanco Queensland, are absolutely dependent on the Indonesian trade and on the live trade. And equally, with the closure of Bahrain last year, we saw another significant decrease. We were buying export sheep for about $100 to $105 at that point in time. You know, overnight, literally the price went down to about $55 or $60. Now, I can only imagine the effect that had on some producers in the southwest, because it was a massive, massive impact. So I think that there is an argument there that live export industry is good because it adds that counterbalance to some of this local consumption. So that's the inward view. So if we're to be selfish and say, let's think about us, is it good for us? I think it is. I think it's great for the Australian community to have a live export industry. When we take an outward view of the live export trade, you know, the reality is that we are a net exporter of livestock, because we've got a herd of about 27 million. I guess the number changes day to day, but about 27 million cattle and probably more than 70 million sheep. So we produce a lot more than what we consume. And yet we've got neighbours on our doorstep who can't produce what they need to consume. And so I guess my contention is that we have the ability to produce, but we also have a responsibility to supply our neighbours who cannot produce for themselves. And having been in some of these countries, went into Qatar fairly recently, and you literally step outside of town and it's desert. They have no opportunity to grow their own food. They have to import from somewhere. And now we are ideally placed to actually supply, to be the food bowl not only for Asia but also for further in the countries further afield. Live exports also create a multiplier effect. I regularly visit Indonesia, and I see how many jobs are created through the live export industry. Obviously, there is a feeding industry. It's very difficult to take a cow in the Northern Territory from 350 kilos to, say, 450 kilos in ideal slaughter weight. In Indonesia, it's very easy to do that. So we're ideally, in Australia, in the north, ideally suited to growing cattle, but they're ideally suited to finishing those cattle. And that's a fantastic thing because it creates agricultural jobs in Indonesia, it creates processing jobs, it creates jobs in tanneries, and so on down the line. Not to mention that it provides food into the community. Okay. One of the issues that I've come across, and certainly I do get a lot of fan mail, particularly when there's incidents like Indonesia and the rejection in Bahrain. And one of the issues that I have come across is a lack of understanding by some members in the Australian community about what actually goes on overseas. And I think it's probably industry's own fault that we haven't done a very good job of communicating what actually goes on. What is it that we're trying to do and what's actually happening? So sometimes I get a lot of people who just have fear about, I don't know what's happening over in Indonesia. How are they killing our cattle? What's happening in the Middle East? And so there's a lot of fear, sometimes prejudice, and sometimes just misinformation or a lack of understanding about what's going on in those other countries. And I think that if we are to survive as an industry, we probably need to take that upon ourselves and do a better job of communicating that. And I'm not saying we haven't done it, and certainly we've had a lot of assistance from organisations like the MLA and Australian Livestock Exports Council and LiveCorp and so on to communicate the message, but I don't think we've done enough, and I suppose that's our homework. I look at these three pictures down the bottom here and have to acknowledge Google Images. And I've stolen them, and I guess I didn't necessarily acknowledge them in my presentation, but, I see people from three different cultures all enjoying food. And there was no need to be fearful of this, And I've sat down at tables that look like that one, barbecue, in my backyard here in Western Australia, and I've sat down in an environment like this, sharing a meal with people in Saudi Arabia or Qatar or Bahrain, and equally I've sat down in Borneo in Indonesia, and I've sat down with these people, and people are people. They're just like us. They just want to get on with life, feed their kids, and get on with it. And I think there is, we I guess haven't done enough to communicate that. That's what it's all about. It's about feeding people, feeding the world. So, talk about live exports and all the fears associated with that and all the stigma associated with live export. We just recently did a little bit of a study to say, well, okay, so what happens if we parked our ship and try to export the same number of sheep that we send to Qatar every month? Well, I'd have to go and find 90 planes to take the same amount of meat over there as I do with one shipment. And of course the cost would be a lot higher. And so just an interesting comparison to say that if I'm looking for 90 737s, it's a pretty tall order to actually get that and get amount of product up there. Whereas in the ship we can do it on one voyage. Just rushing through the last couple of slides. So the live export challenges. And I think the longer that we leave the concerns of our critics unresolved, I think the longer we'll suffer, in this industry. So we need to address them through taking some positive action. And certainly in our company we are starting to look at this very seriously. I mean, not that we've done it in the past, but we certainly get claims like, live export is cruel. And I often ask the person who asks me, well, why is it that you think it's cruel? You know, and let me try to address those risks then. If you're saying it's cruel because sheep die on board, and I say, okay, we'll do everything possible to make sure that they don't. And we'll report on that status, and what's our mortality rate on board, what's our success rate, what are we doing to actually fix some of those issues and so on. So we are, it's a work in progress. We are doing a lot on this, certainly improved immensely over the last 10 or 20 years, and we're still working on it to reduce those rates. But please don't tell me to just stop. You know, I don't accept that. I don't accept absolutes. I accept the challenge to do better, and we certainly take on that challenge and try to do it. But I don't accept stop because I say it's cruel. Tell me why it is, and I'll fix the cause of that. Next question. Exporters cannot be trusted as they put dollars before animal welfare. Don't agree with that statement either, but I respect the people who hold that view. And I'll say, right, what is it that bothers you about that? And we certainly support appropriate regulation. When the government introduced SGAS, following the suspension of trade to Indonesia, we saw that as an opportunity to get our trade restarted. We didn't see that as an attempt to shut us down. And we said, okay, so you've raised the bar. Okay, let's get on board with that. Let's fix it. I think the government was right. It actually catapulted this industry forward by 10 years by improving the standards overnight that would have otherwise have taken us 5 or 10 years. And so I actually see SGAS as a positive thing because it helped us to, you know, it gave us the excuse or the reason to go in the market and say, guys, lift your game. And they accepted that. Most of our customers accepted that and we're still working with it today and I see that as a great success story. We need to increase transparency. Absolutely. I mean, we already have a lot of transparency. I mean, I try to list all of the various acts of Parliament and legislation and regulations that affect our industry, and after page 3 I gave up. There is just so much regulation in this industry. I'm not saying it's bad, I think it is required, but there's a lot of it. And I always need to become a lawyer to navigate my way through the live export business. But that's okay, because it makes things better. Australian public does not support live exporters, live exports. Look, I acknowledge that it's not a perfect system, okay? Just like the road toll, I read in the paper, 200 people have been killed on our roads in the last year. Not acceptable. Does that mean they take away everyone's cars? No, I don't. I'll say, right, how do we fix this problem? More boost buses, more Multinovas, more, put airbags in cars and things like that. So we see there's a continuous improvement, but we don't take the cars apart because they're necessary to support life and to make things happen. We need to, however, respect the views of the people who criticise us because they make us better. You know, if we were just left to our own devices, we just take a shortcut. So I recognise there is a need to have the people who challenge us and criticise us. It makes us step up to the next level. However, we must promote a reasonable and balanced view. You know, there are the extremists who say stop live exports, and there are the guys who say get out of my way, I just want to do it the old way. But I think the middle road is the right way. So we need to address everyone's concerns and do it in a balanced and reasonable way. We also need to consider the benefits of the trade. And I see that quite often whenever I travel, I see that people are getting food that they couldn't otherwise get. You know, getting quality Australian sheep is far better than importing some of the sheep that I've seen come out of Africa that haven't got the same disease-free status that Australian sheep have. And I think that's great. It's a great thing. And of course, little or no control over their destination. You know, we are doing a lot of work in this area right now, and certainly we've seen this step up immensely in the last few months since the introduction of investment. Last slide, I'm getting the signal here. So what do we think we're going to be? Oh, look, I think we're certainly going to be around in the next 10 years. It's not going to be easy. I think we need to keep improving what we do. We need to keep improving standards. Growing demand from the region and further afield will actually underwrite our future, I think, because we are going to continue to see Australia as being a country that produces more than what it can consume. So we've got that fantastic opportunity to keep exporting. We are certainly committed to the industry. Wellard as a company, we've invested in new vessels that have got the best ventilation, the best feeding systems, watering systems, safety systems, and so on. And those are 20 to 30 year investments. So we we're here to stay, and we're not going to go and do anything else because we have put our money where our mouth is, and we certainly believe in the industry, and I think if we do it properly, if we do it safely, then I think the industry's got a future. So we plan to be around for a long time. And we certainly support the industry, an industry which is accountable and transparent. And as I said before, we need to do more work on that. We've got to maintain a focus on continuous improvement, keep improving animal welfare outcomes, keep finding better ways of reducing disease outbreaks, of reducing mortalities on board, of improving land transport, and also of helping our customers to improve their own practices. And I'm certainly seeing a lot of that happening, but never stop there. I think you've got to always keep going and keep improving things overseas. And last but not least, I think we need to have a better engagement model with our critics, not only our critics but also stakeholders like government, like politicians, like our customers and so on, to make sure that we sort of take in everyone's concerns and views and we address them and just be a little bit more open as an industry. Thank you.
Thanks, Fred. Yeah, we'll hold questions till the end. Look, I'm just going to introduce Jody Jankovic and Graham Nicol. Now, Graham, second from the end. From the World Society for Protection of Animals, the WSPA. The WSPA have located or have offices in 14 countries. They're very involved in the Council of Europe, involved in the United Nations, the World Food and Agriculture Organisation, the World Health for Animals Organisation as well. Jody herself is the campaigns manager for the WSPA. Jody's a Perth girl. Doesn't get back here very often these days, but when she can, I'm very happy to. So we're going to hear a bit from Jody to introduce Graham Nicol. Graham Nicol is really the strategy, I guess, advisor for WSPA. He's got a really interesting background in a number of different industries, and it's part of Graham's role really to engage with stakeholders. So I was interested in that last slide for Wellard saying how important it is to engage with stakeholders. That's his role, that's obviously the reason why WSPA are keen to be here today. Welcome, Jody Jankovic.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks, Eric, for inviting us. We're absolutely thrilled to be here because we believe this is really the space that we need to be working, engaging with the farming community. And like I said, I am a Perth girl, so it's great to be back. My mum was very happy to see me. It's beautiful to be on the beach. So I'm just going to quickly introduce who WSPA are, and then I'm going to hand over to Graham Nichols to talk a little bit more. And I think I hope you find our presentation really interesting. We're going to be focusing on an area you may not have assumed we were going to focus on, which is we're actually really going to be looking into the economics of the trade today, not so much focusing on the welfare issues, which I'm sure you're aware of. So, who is WISPA? So we're an international animal welfare organisation. We work in around 50 countries around the world, and we have about 400 staff. So we have worked to protect animals around the world for about 30 years. And we have a very unique approach. We're all about moving the world to protect animals, but at the same time, not to the detriment of people. So we're all about working together, and we approach the live export issue very similarly. Oh, sorry, a bit quick there. So we're the only animal welfare NGO to be granted consultative status with the UN, and so we're very proud of that. We also work closely with the OIE, which is the World Organisation for Animal Health, also FAO, ASEAN and the International Federation of the Red Cross. So we do like to be at that top table, working to make a global difference for animals. We also participate with the Council of Europe. And like I said before, we take a livelihoods approach. So we recognise that humans rely on animals for nutrition, income and social cohesion. And we also invest heavily in research and solutions. So when we come to the table, we like to provide an alternative, provide a solution backed by scientific research rather than on emotion, I guess. So our four main areas, so we work with animals in disasters. So last year we worked in 11 countries supporting, and we helped 500,000 animals in 11 different countries. So often we're working in countries where there are no established disaster systems. So, poor countries that need our support, often helping subsistence farmers in these areas. We also work in animals in farming. So we're working for example, with farmers in India on providing better systems for managing dairy cattle. Laying hens is a particular campaign in the US. Of course, live export's a little controversial one. We also work at animals in the wild, so we've got marine debris campaign, we work with bears in captivity, and we also work in animals in communities, so countries such as Indonesia and Bangladesh, China, on animals vaccinating dogs in particular against rabies, so that obviously helps the human population and it helps the animals as well. So I'm going to hand over to Graham now. He's going to talk to you a little bit more about the economics. Hope you enjoy.
Okay. Thanks, Jodie, and thanks everybody. This is the guts of where Whisper is coming from. We hope that in 10 years the live trade in sheep will be a memory. And we hope it'll be a memory on economic grounds. Basically we're hoping that the demand for live sheep, and we're working to ensure as far as we can that the demand for live sheep is replaced by the demand for carcass, chilled, frozen or boxed meat. We're not an animal rights organisation. We're an animal welfare organisation. The difference is we do not believe that you cannot use animals, you can't farm animals. We're supporters of a domestic processing industry. We think that that is the way to go. Slaughter domestically, export meat, rather than export live animals and get them slaughtered overseas. And we think there's all sorts of value-added arguments, etc., to justify that. So basically, we're hoping that the live sheep trade will have gone and that the live cattle trade will have moderated to a point where, from our perspective, it's not an issue. Now, that's a bit of a vague statement. We don't agree in principle with long-distance live export. We think that long-distance live export of animals is an inherently cruel process. We just don't think it's good in an animal welfare context. But a short-distance trade from Broome, from Darwin to Indonesia, that's arguable. And we acknowledge that. If an animal's not on a ship for a hell of a long time, how badly impacted is the welfare of that animal? A hell of a lot less badly impacted than if it's on a ship to the Middle East for 35, 40, 50 days, whatever length the trip ends up being. Okay, so when I talk about not at a level that's not an issue, whereas we don't like the idea, we acknowledge the fact that there are graziers up in the Kimberley where the nearest abattoir is Indonesia, and the only way to get to that abattoir is by ship. So that's a whole lot better than 2,500, 3,000 k's in a semi-trailer down to the abattoirs down here. So we're pragmatic in that sense. We also acknowledge that whenever there is a demand for live animals, there will be people prepared to supply live animals. Fair enough. It's not an illegal trade. Where there is demand for drugs, people supply it, that's an illegal trade. So, the economic motivation, the economic incentive is real, is valid, it's relevant. We acknowledge that. Okay, we also, just as part of this thing here, we don't look for suspension. We don't look for bans. We don't look for legislation to kill the trade. Our approach is we think, our intention is for it to be an economically focused trade. We think that if the trade right now, as far as we're concerned, to the Middle East, is driven by tariffs, by subsidies. In the Gulf Cooperation states, they are currently spending something of the order of 7% of regional GDP subsidising fuel, subsidising food. And that's a hell of a big subsidy. We've got concerns as to how long that's going to be available, and that's one of the things I'll focus on shortly. But we look at it from a level playing field side. Get rid of tariffs, get rid of subsidies, and we think that the meat trade will compete on its own merits with the live trade, And we think that there will be a transition, and a transition over time. And that's what we argue for. We don't argue for government to come in and impose legislation. That may be the point of difference between WISPA and other animal organisations. But that's where we're coming from. We're coming from a dry, rational, futuristic sort of sense. Okay, why do we think we're going to get to where we want to go? We'll have achieved a moderation in demand. Let me just go back a bit. I've jumped the slide, I think. Yeah, just come to this thing. Okay, in the Gulf Cooperation states, which are the main destination for Australia's live sheep, we've got a situation where they are moving into a long-established pattern in developing countries where they go for purchase of their animal protein in a convenient manner through supermarkets. This is tradition. Every developing country around the world, it's happening in Indonesia, it's happening in the Gulf Cooperation Council states as well, is as they get more disposable income, people prefer to get their produce from supermarkets. So you've got in the Gulf Cooperation Council states highly urbanised population. 86% of them live in urbanised areas. 28% of these characters are under 15. They're rich. In 2011, their GDP per capita was $44,670. Ours is $50,000. They're richer than us. They're growing. They've got 600 million. By 2025, they reckon it'll be 870 million. So these guys are rich. The Gulf Cooperation Council states are not your downtrodden, miserable, suffering, starving poor. These guys are as well off as we are. Indonesia, seriously big destination for our live cattle trade. That's urbanising too. 44% urban areas. It's increasing by 1.7% a year. In other words, by an amount slightly bigger than the city of Sydney that are moving into the cities. They're young. Their median age is 28. 44% of the young ones are under 24. And for the last 10 years, they've had a GDP growth of 6% plus, matched up with ours. These guys are growing. I think we're something like 16th in the world scale of economies. These guys are 17th. They're one beneath us. They are not the poor, downtrodden, starving masses. In Indonesia, way back, we go back about 5 or 6 years, they estimated that they had a population of millionaires of 23 odd million, as big as our population. Refrigeration, different story. In the Gulf Cooperation states, they reckon it's 99.5. They take that estimate because every bugger and his dog's got a fridge, got a freezer. Indonesia, not so. Indonesia, the estimate was 45% refrigeration penetration in 2017, and that will be double that of 2012. So not a massive amount of refrigeration in Indonesia. We acknowledge that. We acknowledge the importance of the wet meat trade. Just quickly, good meat export opportunities in Australia. World markets are growing. Okay, you look at I won't talk over that, but you can see the sort of size of the exports and how big the meat export markets are growing. Okay, we're also looking more on the supply side now. We're looking for options in Australia. The AA abattoir in Livingston really support that. We think it's a fantastic venture. It disproves some of the notions that you can't have abattoirs in the Northern Territory. If David Farley and his mob are prepared to spend $85 million of their own, that's a fair vote of confidence there. We also think that the developments of the Yeater Pastoral Company, Kimberley Pastoral Investments, using Singapore money, fantastic. That's great. We're all for local processing, domestic processing. Will there be something up in Farmanco? Who knows? But at least people are looking at it. People are thinking about it. So the notion that you just automatically can't have abattoirs in the northern part of Australia We disagree with that. Could go into that in more detail in terms of the history of it, and you see why that is the fact. It's not just because it's a hard part of the world. There are all sorts of other reasons that went to it. Positive developments that we acknowledge: purchase by livestock shipping, reopening of Gingin, Wellard's purchasing of Beaufort River, the Wamco successes. Great. Again, all more domestic processing. All good stuff. Other issues, political risks. Okay, you look at things like Bahrain. Crappy situation. Were those animals really cooked, really sick? No, that was just politics. All sorts of reasons for that. Subsidies, I mentioned 7%, not good. Supply overhang because of, you've got live trade, you've got meat trade. Something goes wrong with the live trade, a disaster. There's a potential supply down, pressure down. So on prices. And animal welfare risks. Okay, last. I mean, like it or not, the community is concerned with animal welfare. That concern is not going to go away. If anything, it's going to grow. As we get richer as a nation, as we get more idle time, more spare time, we look inwards, we navel gaze, we want to know where our food's coming from, we demand quality, etc., etc. It's just part of the progress that we are engaged in as an economy, as a community. Employment. We reckon that 700 to 800 sheep processing jobs there would be an additional 700 to 800 processing jobs if you were to process locally. AACO is claiming that it will produce 260 direct jobs, and we talk about indirect jobs, 800 in total. That's all specified for our originates. So employment-wise, it's pretty good as well. And then if you look at regional gross product, you're looking at $200 million expenditure on the local region. I mean, all this lot is money, value-added, happening in Australia. $7 to $12 per sheep if it's processed locally, compared to if it's sent overseas or full-based. So economically, the case stacks up. In an animal welfare context, we think it also stacks up. We acknowledge the fact that the government has brought in welfare SCAS. That's good. But SCAS works in Australia. It might work on the ship. We haven't a clue yet because we don't know. There's no transparency. Does it work overseas? Doubtful, because they're foreign countries. We can't impose our will on them. We can try to train them. We can try to persuade them. How sustainable is that in the long term? Meat processing is not a high-class job. There's a massive turnover. No matter how many locals you train, you're going to have to train more and more and more. Their whole customs, their whole traditions, the whole way they approach animal welfare. Saudi Arabia doesn't even have animal welfare legislation. So how the hell can they impose animal welfare standards? I mean, you know, it's good. SCAS is good in that it's a step in the right direction. But Jesus has a whole long way to go. Okay, a little bit there on the employment. You can see 29,000 people employed in domestic meat processing, 10,000 underwritten by the live trade. It's not to dump on that, but proportionally, it's not quite the big deal that it may sometimes be seen to be. What are we asking for? All we're asking for is the Australian government, meat processors, livestock producers, to get together, start thinking ahead. What is the trend that this industry is facing? Is live trade, is the demand going to be there forever? Well, we don't. So therefore, what should we do? Start thinking about it, start discussing it. Right now, we have a dialogue where we, as Whisper, say this, the animal producers say this, and we don't talk. We throw mud at each other. It's just a stupid situation. We've been asking for the last 18 months for a dialogue with the opposition and with the government. To a degree, we've got a dialogue. We're talking to the National Farmers Federation. We're going to make a presentation to them in November. And quite possibly we will, depending on how they take our presentation, get into a system of engagement with them, into some sort of relationship with them. That's good, because we're not looking for a ban, we're not looking for a legislative imposition, we're looking for a transition over a time period, a market-led transition based on the realities of tariffs, based on the realities of subsidies, based on risk management, based on what is the most sustainable outcome in the longer term, based on what produces the greatest value added to Australia for the long term, based on what produces employment. Fair enough, there's value added in Indonesia right now through their tanning and whatever. Why isn't that in Australia? Why do we have to support an Indonesian tanning industry? Why do we have one in Australia? I mean, these are the sort of questions that we ask. These are the sort of questions that we want to see a discussion on. Okay, thanks very much. I'll leave it at that. Heaps more to go, but happy to answer, happy to address all that in question time.
Again, and I'll introduce you to Senator Chris Back. Now, some of you will probably come across Senator Chris back in your early days when he was a vet and lecturing at the US a long time ago. It seemed all the young girls who were interested in agriculture were all studying equine management, and so we all thought maybe we should be over at Chris's stable a bit more than our own. But Chris has obviously been involved in quite a few things since then. He's been the Chief Executive Officer of the Rottnest Island Board. He's also been Chief Executive Officer for a number of years of the Bushfires Board as well, and now involved obviously in political arena with the Liberals. I think it's very important for us to, as an industry, to have someone who really comes from the grassroots in our industry and is educated, who's also taken an interest in this aspect of live export. So I'd like to welcome Senator Chris Back.
Thanks, Eric. Ladies and gentlemen, Eric was at Muresk in the mid-80s. It's obvious that neither of us knew too much about IT in that era and the rest, but one of the mistakes you always make in a case like this, you ask someone at the back, can you hear me? Recently I did that and this fellow stood up and said, yes, unfortunately I can. He said, but I'm very happy to swap with someone who can't. I'm not going to ask you that question again. It's a very, very interesting, very exciting topic for me because if in 17 days' time we're privileged with government, I hope very much to be part of the process which actually looks at the vision for the next 10 years. It's also interesting to stand here and say yes, yes and yes, as I've heard the three speakers before me. Simply because we're not looking at one or the other, ladies and gentlemen, we are looking at both of them and all of them. Most interesting, Paul's discussion earlier with regard particularly to China and why China, when there's 1.2 billion of them, and whatever happens in China, has a huge impact. 1 billion people tonight will go to bed hungry, and most of them in our region of the world. The Millennium Goal set at the change of the century was to halve poverty by 2015. That's 18 months away and we're not going to do it. Chinese population was 35% urban 15 years ago. It's now 50 and it's going to be 65% urban in the next 15 to 20 years. And the final stat about China, because it's so important, is that in the space of 10 years in Hu Jintao's presidency, the average income in China went from $1,000 per annum to $5,000. It went up by a factor of 5 in 10 years. So what do we learn about all that? They're becoming wealthier, as you have seen. Their diet is changing, as we all understand. And if we do it right, if we do it properly, we are well positioned. I was in our embassy in Beijing last July and I said to our agricultural attaché, why are we selling so few agricultural commodities into China? He said, Chris, because they're paranoid about limiting supply to one or two suppliers. And they see that we're such a massive supplier of iron ore and they don't want to become so reliant on us. And I said, look, we're not a big producer of beef, as you saw from Paul's slide. Next to the Brazilians, we happen to be the second biggest exporter, but we are by no means the biggest producer. So we've got some tremendous opportunities and we've got some challenges, and that's why I say yes, yes and yes. I want to see in the next 10 years a scenario in which our beef and sheep meat sales are very, very stable and strong and growing, and I want to see a scenario in which our live export trade does the same. And I'll address animal welfare first. As a veterinarian who was involved in the trade from the 1980s, and the brother of a veterinarian who carried on my live export trade and is still involved, I can tell you with a high degree of pride that Australia is the only country in the world, of the 109 that export live animals around the world, there is one that has ever invested time and money and personnel into increasing animal welfare standards in our target markets. I'm very proud to have been part of that process over time. And what I can tell you, as we're seeing now, is the fact that as we have been there to increase animal welfare standards, in shipping and in transport and in feedlotting and in processing, which we are not there yet with, I accept that. But what's happened is that local animal welfare standards have increased and improved. People challenge me and say, lovely statement, Chris, prove it. I'll give you 2 examples. Last year, in the Cibinong abattoir in Indonesia, we opened up to the front page of the Australian, Melinda Ralph, writing about the fact, presented by activists and others, including my Senate colleague, Lee Rhiannon, that there had been a situation in a Cibinong abattoir in which these cattle, these Australian cattle, had not been slaughtered according to SCAS standards, and what a shocking thing was, an Australian stood there helpless. I took 2 phone calls. One a phone call to Perth, the second was a phone call to Indonesia. And I established what the facts were, which DAF, some months later, established them to be the same facts. First, they weren't Australian cattle. Secondly, the Australians were not standing there helpless in the abattoir. But thirdly, they were a local Balinese line of cattle being slaughtered according to Australian standards. Why? Because the slaughtermen and the meat processors had found that it was the most convenient way of doing it. Second example, in Doha last year at the festival of Eid, where in the past we saw circumstances, I saw it, we all did, sheep were tied up, chucked on the back of the truck, or on the top of the truck, or in the boot. What we saw in Doha last year, and repeated, and it was a result of Australian intervention, was that instead of these animals being taken home and slaughtered in the backyard, they actually were slaughtered in the approved meat working facilities. The families came in, they watched them being processed, they then took the carcass home. But more importantly, so were the local African sheep and the Egyptian sheep and all the other sheep. So in other words, 2 examples recently where our animal welfare standards have lifted standards internationally. The obvious point, ladies and gentlemen, is that if and when and as we are denied access to the live export trades in those countries, 2 things happen. First of all, we lose the meat trade. Again, you say, give me an example, Saudi Arabia. In the 1980s, we lost the meat, the live export trade, we immediately lost the meat trade. Now, we've lost the live export trade, we've lost the meat trade. I agree with Graham. We've got a long way to go with the Saudis. But I met with the Saudi ambassador in Canberra 4 or 5 weeks ago. He said, we are importing 9 million sheep a year at the moment, Senator Back, and we're not importing one from you. And by the way, we're in such a short need of sheep meat that we are actually flying them in from Georgia on jumbo jets. Where is the relationship between us and where's it gone? And my second example, in terms of loss of beef, when we had the suspension of the trade, and I don't have 15 minutes time to talk to you about the engagement I had with Joe Ludwig and others to try and prevent that happening, but nevertheless, you would have thought, wouldn't you, that when the sale of live cattle to Indonesia halved between 2011 and 12, logic would have told you that beef sales would have doubled. What happened? Beef sales also halved. Let me tell you what else has happened, ladies and gentlemen. The illegal sale of buffalo meat from India has gone through the roof because prices have gone through the roof in Indonesia. Why is that concerned? Because they've got foot and mouth disease. That's why
it's a lot more difficult to have stunning accepted over there. At the moment, I can't think of a client of ours who is adopting stunning for sheep. However, we still do insist that they follow international standards, so the OIE standards for the slaughter of livestock. Obviously, with sheep, you haven't got the same safety issues and screening issues. Most of our clients operate quite modern abattoirs, so they'll have the V-belts, and I've personally observed quite a number of kills when I've gone over there, and it's a very efficient, quick process, and it certainly meets the international standards. In terms of jobs, I was being a little bit naughty when I was thinking about that, but we operate an abattoir here in Western Australia. We also operate an abattoir in the Philippines for cattle. We've done a lot of work in understanding what are the differences in slaughter costs. And I can tell you that in the Philippines, right today, we're slaughtering today, the cost of slaughtering an animal costs me 1/5 of what it costs anyone else in Australia. Probably less than that. So I sort of liken that to the clothes that you people are wearing today. And I'm having a guess that about 90% of you are probably wearing clothes made in China. The materials probably came from Australia or came from America or somewhere else, but the manufacturing comes from China. It's probably 95%. So what happened to that industry? You know, clothes were being made in Australia back in the 50s and 60s. Because my mum was a seamstress, and that's what she was working in back in the 1950s and 60s. Whereas now, you struggle to go to Kmart and buy something which is not made in China. So, how do we resolve that issue? You know, and you know, can we resolve that issue? Are we going to come to a day when we say, hey, it's actually cheaper to send my sheep and my cattle overseas, get them slaughtered and re-import the meat? I hope it never happens. But we have to face realities that economics drive some of these decisions. That the cost of slaughter in Australia is quite high, and I think that is we're not going to see much of a change there. Even though we're importing workers using 457 visas, you know, the cost of slaughtering in Australia is quite high. I met with the AACO ops manager about 5 weeks ago in Brisbane, and I asked him, so how's the abattoir going? He said, oh, it's going great. No problems. And I said, look, you know, there's a few people across the north who don't believe that business case will ever stand up. He goes, no, we're committed to it and we're planning ahead with it. But I think there's a reason why there hasn't been an abattoir in the north for the last 20 years. Because economically, it doesn't work. And we've certainly looked at the same thing. We did the same business case, we did the same numbers, and we just said, we don't see how this is going to work for us as a company. And so we chose to actually say, well, where is it that I can pull an animal at 350 kilos out of the north, value at it, so get the animal to slaughter weight, say to 450 or 500 kilos, and then slaughter it, and then come out with a product that's sellable at a reasonable price. We looked at the business case of doing that in the north, and we just couldn't get it to stack up. We looked at doing that by exporting to either Indonesia or the Philippines or another country, and suddenly we've got a product which we can sell. And so these are the commercial decisions, the financial decisions that we have to take as a business. Now, is that good or bad? Well, I don't know. Do we divert our energies into producing food and then processing it somewhere else, or do we try to do all the processing here? You know, so if we look at what's happening with the textile industries, if we look at what's happening right now with our motor vehicle industries, are we kidding ourselves or are we being realistic? Now, I don't have the right answer. And every company, I guess, chooses their own path, but I wouldn't necessarily go running one off against the other.
One question, Amy.
Yeah, look,
Good afternoon.
I think that clarification by Fred of some of the economics is quite enlightening. And I guess my question was going to be to Dawson, I guess, as in the processing camp and as a producer, do you believe that Australia will ever be able to domestically process livestock and be competitive with our I guess, doing the same job offshore? At the end of the day, the critical factor for me as a producer, I've got a foot in both camps, both an export camp and for domestic livestock going to domestic abattoirs, is return. It's the return. And Fred, your comments, I mean, that really nails it. And to be quite honest with you, I've travelled fairly extensively around the world, and I do really wonder whether we will have any sort of domestic manufacturing or processing business left in 10 or 15 years' time unless we sort out our wage structure.
Do you want to respond to that, Dawson?
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting question to pose. My belief is that over a period of time, that the main difference is in wages. I think that's highlighted by Fred's comments about processing in the Philippines. We've had the same experience in going to China to bring back manufactured goods. You bring them back for about 40% of the cost that you can buy the raw materials here to make yourself. So there's a huge difference, and it all comes down to labour, the cost of labour. China, $2 an hour for a welder. Australia, at $40 an hour, 20 times the difference, and that just highlights the difference in the costs. But as I spoke before about the labour requirements, I believe automation will help us to overcome a lot of that. As long as our automation is not too expensive, then I believe that we'll gradually wear this down, and to the stage where the labour factor is not so significant, and I believe we will be continue to be efficient and competitive. So long as we keep on bringing in all the efficiencies that are available as we go. Otherwise, we'll fall behind the 8 ball. I think at WAMCO in the last 10, 12 years, we've put in about $25 million worth of improvements. And that's starting to reflect in our balance sheet and our profitability at the end of each year. So if the industry is prepared to do that, then I believe that the future is very good.
Thanks, Dawson. Look, that wraps up the session. We're a little bit over time. We'll reconvene back from lunch break. The breaks are pretty important as far as you guys getting a chance to mingle with each other. We'll reconvene back at 1:45 after lunch. But just before we do that, I'd like to thank Fred, Jody, Dawson, Graham and Chris. I think you agree with a really good calibre of speakers across those sections, and we really appreciate you making the time. I found it today.